I invited my son and daughter-in-law to a holiday dinner. They didn't show. They went to her parents instead. I sat alone until the delivery guy brought me a letter. What I read changed everything. The house always felt biggest when I was waiting for someone. It wasn't the square footage, not the 12-foot ceilings my late husband, David, had been so proud of. It was the silence. A silence that seemed to have its own weight, pressing down on the old hardwood floors and soaking into the velvet curtains. But today, the silence was different. It was a temporary, hopeful kind of quiet, the kind that comes before a storm of happy noise. It was Thanksgiving morning, and my son, Michael, and his wife, Jessica, were coming for dinner. This was the first Thanksgiving in 5 years they'd be spending with me, just the three of us. And my heart felt like a balloon, inflated with a fragile, shimmering joy. I'd been humming since I woke up at 5:30, before the sun had even thought about streaking the gray sky with pink. The turkey, a 20-pounder that was frankly ridiculous for 3 people, was already in the oven, its skin glistening with butter and herbs. The whole house smelled of rosemary and thyme, a scent so deeply woven into my memories of happier holidays that it was almost a physical presence, a ghost of Thanksgivings past. I ran a hand over the dining room table, a solid oak piece David had inherited from his grandfather. I'd polished it yesterday until I could see my own tired, smiling face reflected in its dark surface. 3 place settings. The good china, the one with the little gold rims that we only ever used for Christmas and Thanksgiving. The silverware, heavy and ornate, that had been a wedding gift 35 years ago. I even folded the linen napkins into fancy little swans, a trick I'd seen in a magazine and practiced for an hour last night until I got it just right. Everything had to be perfect. It felt like more than just a dinner. It felt like a chance to reclaim something, a piece of the family I thought I was losing. Michael was my only child, my world, especially after David passed away 7 years ago. He was a good boy, a kind soul with his father's gentle eyes and easy smile. But since he'd married Jessica 3 years ago, things had shifted. It wasn't a big, dramatic change. It was a slow, subtle erosion, little things. He'd call less often. When he did, the conversations felt shorter, more perfunctory. Jessica was always there, her voice in the background, a high musical chime that somehow always managed to sound like a correction. "Michael, honey, we have to go." "Michael, tell your mother we're busy Saturday." Jessica was polished. That was the best word for her. Her hair was always perfectly styled, her nails immaculate, her clothes looking like they'd been pulled from a catalog for a life I didn't understand. She came from money, the kind of quiet, old money that announces itself not with flash, but with an unshakable, effortless confidence. Her parents, the Millers, lived in a sprawling mansion over in Oak Creek, the part of town where the houses have names instead of numbers. They were nice enough to me, in a distant, vaguely clinical way. They'd smile their perfectly white smiles and ask how I was keeping busy, a question that always made me feel like a retired show pony. For the last 4 Thanksgivings, Michael and Jessica had gone to her parents. It was just easier, they said. The Millers had a huge family gathering, a catered affair. It was an event. My quiet little dinner for 3 couldn't compete. But this year, Michael had called me himself. I remembered the exact moment 2 weeks ago. I was in the garden, pulling up the last of the dead tomato vines, my hands caked in dirt. "Mom?" he'd said, his voice sounding younger than it had in a long time. Jess and I were talking. We were thinking, we'd really love to have Thanksgiving with you this year. Just us, like we used to. I had to sit down on the porch steps, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Oh, Michael, really?" I tried to keep my voice even, not to let the desperate hope spill out. "Yeah," he said. "Really. Jess thinks it's a great idea. She said she wants to learn how you make your sweet potato casserole." That last part was the clincher. Jessica, who considered cooking to be ordering from the right restaurant, wanted my recipe. It felt like an olive branch, a sign that she was finally, truly trying to be part of our little family, not just an extension of hers. I'd spent the next 2 weeks in a state of blissful planning. I dug out all of David's favorite recipes. I'd bought new candles for the centerpiece. I'd even cleaned out the guest room, changing the sheets and putting fresh towels in the bathroom, just in case they decided to stay the night, just in case the evening was so wonderful they didn't want it to end. By 2 in the afternoon, the house was a symphony of warmth and delicious smells. The turkey was resting on the counter, its skin a perfect crackling brown. The mashed potatoes were creamy and buttery, waiting in a bowl covered with foil. The green bean casserole was bubbling in the oven, its fried onion topping sending out an aroma that was pure comfort. The pies, one pumpkin, one pecan, Michael's favorite, were cooling on the rack. I looked around the kitchen at the controlled, happy chaos and felt a profound sense of contentment. This was what I was good at. This was my love, made tangible and edible. I smoothed my apron and glanced at the clock. They were due at 3, just 1 hour to go. I decided to get ready. I showered and put on the new sweater I'd bought for the occasion, a soft, cranberry-colored cashmere. I even put on a little makeup, something I rarely did anymore. I wanted to look nice. I wanted them to see me not as a lonely old woman, but as the vibrant, capable matriarch of this small but precious family. I sat in the living room, the one we called the formal living room that was never used. And I waited. The grandfather clock in the hall, another family heirloom, ticked away the minutes. Each tick seemed to echo in the quiet house, a steady, rhythmic countdown to their arrival. 3 o'clock came and went. I wasn't worried. Traffic could be tricky on a holiday. Or maybe they stopped to pick up a bottle of sparkling cider or some flowers for the table. At 3:15, my placid contentment began to fray at the edges. I walked to the front window and peered through the curtains, looking down the empty street. The sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long golden shadows across the manicured lawns of my neighbors. I could see their houses, lights on, cars in the driveways. I could almost hear the distant murmur of their own family gatherings. I picked up my phone. No texts, no missed calls. I scrolled back through my conversation with Michael. The last one was from yesterday. "Can't wait for tomorrow, Mom. Smells like home already." I'd send him back a string of heart emojis, feeling like a teenager. Now, the message seemed to mock me. I told myself to be patient. They were adults. They had their own lives. 100 things could have delayed them. But a cold little knot was beginning to form in the pit of my stomach. The silence in the house was no longer hopeful. It was starting to feel heavy again, a thick, suffocating blanket. I went back to the dining room and looked at the 3 perfectly set places. The 3 little napkin swans waiting for hands that hadn't arrived. The candles in the centerpiece remained unlit. The room was pristine, beautiful, and heartbreakingly empty. It looked like a museum exhibit. A family dinner, circa 2025. I touched the back of Michael's chair, the one he'd sat in since he was old enough to be out of a high chair. And for the first time that day, I allowed a sliver of doubt to pierce my carefully constructed happiness. What if the casserole recipe wasn't all she wanted? By 4 o'clock, the knot in my stomach had grown into a cold, heavy stone. The sun had lost its warmth, and the light slanting through the windows was a pale, watery gold. The house was cooling down. Or maybe it was just me. I had started a pathetic little ritual of walking from the living room window to the kitchen clock every 5 minutes. Each trip down the hall felt longer, the ticking of the grandfather clock louder, more accusatory. Tick-tock, they're late. Tick-tock, they're not coming. I tried to push the thought away, to smother it with logic. There had to be a reason. A flat tire, a traffic jam of epic proportions. Maybe one of them wasn't feeling well. A simple, innocent explanation. At 4:15, I broke my own rule. I told myself I wouldn't be one of those mothers, the kind who calls and calls, her panic escalating with every unanswered ring. But I couldn't help it. I dialed Michael's number. My thumb hovered over the call button for a second before I pressed it, as if making the call would somehow make my fears real. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring was a fresh wave of anxiety. On the 5th ring, it went to voicemail. "Hey, you've reached Michael? Leave a message." His voice, so full of life and cheer, was a cruel irony. I didn't leave a message. What would I say? "Michael, where are you? The turkey is getting cold and your mother is falling apart." I hung up, my hand trembling slightly. "Okay. Plan B, Jessica." I rarely called her directly. Our communication was usually filtered through Michael. But this was an emergency, of sorts. I found her number in my contacts, listed under Jessica, Michael's wife. I really should have changed that. It felt so impersonal. I pressed call. It didn't even ring. It went straight to voicemail. "Hi, you've reached Jessica. I'm unavailable right now, but leave your name and number." Her voice was crisp, efficient, like a receptionist's. My heart sank. A phone turned off, or in an area with no service. That could mean anything. They could be driving through a dead zone, or they could have turned their phones off intentionally. The thought was ugly, and I tried to shove it back into the dark corner of my mind where I kept all the other unpleasant possibilities. I went back to the kitchen and stared at the feast I had prepared. The beautiful golden brown turkey now looked like a sad, abandoned monument. The mashed potatoes would be gummy. The gravy had a thin skin forming on its surface. All that work, all that love, congealing on the countertop. I felt a surge of foolishness, of humiliation. I had been so ridiculously, naively happy. I had built this whole day up in my mind, creating a fantasy of reconciliation and familial bliss. I had even imagined Jessica leaning over the stove with me, notebook in hand, as I shared the secret to my sweet potato casserole. It was a little bit of orange zest. Now the only thing in the air was the fading smell of rosemary and the pungent scent of my own disappointment. I decided to text Michael. It felt less intrusive, less desperate than calling again. "Hey, honey, just checking in. Hope everything is okay. Dinner is ready whenever you get here." I added a smiley face emoji at the end, a sad little attempt to sound casual and unbothered. I put the phone on the counter, screen side up, and stared at it, willing it to light up with a response. Nothing. 5 minutes passed. 10, 15. The little delivered receipt under my message was a tiny digital confirmation of my growing irrelevance. He had received the message. He was just choosing not to answer it. The fight went out of me then. It was a slow deflation, like that balloon of happiness I'd felt this morning had been pricked by a tiny, sharp pin. I walked over to the dining room table and sank into my own chair. I stared across at the 2 empty seats, the 2 pristine place settings. My reflection stared back at me from the polished wood, a tired woman with sad eyes and a ridiculous cranberry-colored sweater. The silence in the house was no longer a wait. It was a roar, a deafening, overwhelming roar of absence. I thought about past Thanksgivings, the ones with David, when the house was filled with his booming laugh and the sound of whatever football game he was watching on TV. The ones when Michael was a little boy, his face smeared with pumpkin pie, chattering excitedly about his school projects. These memories, which usually brought me comfort, now felt like daggers. They were ghosts of a life that was gone, a life where I was needed, where my table was full. I must have sat there for an hour, lost in a fog of sorrow and confusion. The sky outside had deepened to a bruised purple. The streetlights flickered on. Inside, the house was dark, save for the dim light from the kitchen. I didn't bother to turn on any lamps. The darkness felt appropriate. It matched the landscape of my heart. And then, a sound. A cheerful little ping from my phone on the kitchen counter. Hope, that stubborn, idiotic weed, shot through me. I practically ran to the kitchen, my hand snatching the phone off the granite. It was a text from Michael. My fingers fumbled as I unlocked the screen. The message was short, terse, devoid of any warmth. "So sorry, Mom. Something major came up with Jessica's family. We had to go to her parents. It was an emergency. I'll call and explain tomorrow. Hope you had a good day." I read it once, twice, a third time. The words blurred through a sudden film of tears. An emergency. At her parents'. The same parents whose grand catered event they had chosen over me for the past 4 years. The phrasing was so cold, so corporate. Something major came up. Had to go. Not, "We're so sorry we missed it." Not, "I feel terrible." Just a sterile, dismissive statement. And the last line, "Hope you had a good day." The cruelty of it, whether intentional or not, took my breath away. He knew I had spent weeks planning this. He knew I was alone. What kind of good day did he think I could possibly have had? The tears that had been threatening all afternoon finally came. They weren't loud, racking sobs. They were silent, hot tears that streamed down my face and dripped onto my fancy cashmere sweater. I stood in my dark, silent kitchen, surrounded by the ruins of my carefully planned dinner, and wept for the son I felt I had lost. The emergency wasn't a flat tire or a sudden illness. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the emergency was me. My dinner, my hopes, my little world, that was the thing they had to escape from. I slowly, methodically, began to scrape the food from the serving dishes into the trash can. The mashed potatoes, the green beans, the stuffing. It made a soft, wet sound as it hit the bottom of the bag. It was the sound of defeat. I left the turkey on the counter. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I just turned off the kitchen light, walked back into the living room, and sat down in the dark, alone. The hours after that text message blended into a gray, timeless fog. I didn't move from the armchair in the living room. I just sat there, a statue carved from grief, as the darkness outside deepened from twilight to true night. The grandfather clock chimed 7, then 8, then 9. Each chime was a hammer blow against the anvil of my solitude. My body ached with a strange combination of tension and exhaustion. I felt hollowed out, scooped clean of everything but a dull, throbbing pain in my chest. The phone lay on the end table beside me, dark and silent. I had no desire to look at it, no energy to hope for another message. Michael's text had been a final punctuation mark on a chapter I didn't even know was being written. My mind, unbidden, began to play cruel tricks on me. I started to dissect every interaction I'd had with Jessica over the past 3 years. Her smiles, which always seemed a little too bright, a little too tight at the corners. The way her eyes would flick over my furniture, my clothes, with a look that I had once mistaken for polite interest, but now re-evaluated as cool appraisal. Her compliments always had a faint backhanded quality. "Oh, this old house has such character," she'd say, the emphasis on old making it sound like a charming but hopeless fixer-upper. "Michael talks so much about your cooking," she'd remark, with the air of an anthropologist discussing a quaint native custom. I had always brushed these moments aside, telling myself I was being too sensitive, that I was the dreaded mother-in-law from a sitcom, looking for fault where there was none. I had wanted so desperately for us to get along, for her to love my son as much as I did, and for her to, in turn, like me. Now, sitting in the dark, I felt a chilling certainty that she didn't just dislike me. She held me in contempt, and she had taught my son to do the same. Around 9:30, I finally summoned the will to move. My joints creaked in protest. I felt ancient, brittle. My first instinct was to clean. It was David's coping mechanism, and I had inherited it. When his mother passed, he had spent a weekend silently, methodically cleaning out the garage. It was a way of imposing order on a world that had spun into chaos. I walked into the kitchen and flicked on the light. The brightness was jarring. The turkey was still on the counter, a pale, greasy monolith. I couldn't bear to look at it. I turned to the dining room instead. The 3 perfect place settings, the napkin swans, the unlit candles. It all had to go. I started clearing the table, my movements stiff and robotic. I scraped the untouched plates into the trash bag, the clatter of silverware against china echoing in the cavernous silence. I unceremoniously dumped the expensive cranberry arrangement from the centerpiece into the bin. I gathered up the silverware and dropped it into the sink with a jarring crash. I didn't care if it got scratched. The gleam of the silver felt like a mockery. As I was picking up the last of the wine glasses, the ones I'd hoped we'd fill with sparkling cider to toast our new beginning, the doorbell rang. The sound was so unexpected, so alien in the profound quiet, that I physically jumped, and the glass slipped from my hand, shattering on the tile floor. My heart leapt into my throat. For one wild, irrational second, I thought it was them. Michael and Jessica, consumed by guilt, come to apologize in person. I rushed to the door, my bare feet crunching on the tiny shards of glass without me even noticing the pain. I didn't even look through the peephole. I just flung the door open, a torrent of frantic, hopeful words ready on my lips. But it wasn't them. Standing on my doorstep, bathed in the yellow glow of the porch light, was a young man I had never seen before. He was skinny, probably in his early 20s, with a nervous energy about him. He wore a plain gray hoodie and jeans, no uniform, no logo. He was holding a large, stiff manila envelope. He looked less like a professional courier and more like a kid who had drawn the short straw for an unpleasant task. Sarah Peterson?" he asked, his eyes darting from my face to the house number next to the door, then back again. "Yes," I said, my voice hoarse. The hope drained out of me as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a confused emptiness. "I have a delivery for you," he said, holding out the envelope. It wasn't a package from Amazon or a food delivery. It was just a plain 9x12 envelope. No stamps, no return address. My name and address were printed on a stark white label in a simple, blocky font. "A delivery? From who?" I asked. My brow furrowed. I wasn't expecting anything. The young man shrugged, looking deeply uncomfortable. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I don't know, ma'am. I was just paid to bring this to you. Tonight. My boss said it was important. The way he said important was strange, freighted with a significance he clearly didn't understand, but had been instructed to convey. Your boss? Yeah. Look, I was just told to make sure you got it in your hands personally. That's all. He pushed the envelope toward me again, more insistently this time. Hesitantly, I took it. It was surprisingly heavy, stiff with what felt like a thick stack of papers inside. It was cool to the touch. As soon as my fingers closed around it, the young man seemed to relax, his duty done. He took a step back, already turning to leave. Wait, I called after him. Who paid you to do this? He just shook his head, already jogging down the porch steps. I don't know his name. Sorry. He disappeared into the darkness of the street before I could ask another question. I stood in the open doorway for a long moment, the cool night air raising goosebumps on my arms. I looked down at the mysterious envelope in my hand. 100 bizarre theories flashed through my mind. Was it some kind of sweepstakes scam? A religious tract? A political mailing? But none of those felt right. The strange, nervous energy of the delivery boy, the insistence on a personal, late-night delivery. It felt different. It felt personal. I closed the door, locking the deadbolt with a decisive click. I walked back toward the kitchen, my bare foot finally registering the sharp sting of the broken glass. I looked down and saw a small, bright red bead of blood welling up on my sole. I ignored it. I limped over to the kitchen table, the one where Michael and I used to do his homework, and sat down. I placed the envelope on the worn wooden surface in front of me. It lay there, inert and yet pulsing with a strange potential energy. My hands were trembling again, but this time it wasn't from sadness. It was from a different kind of feeling, a cold, sharp-edged premonition. With a deep breath, I slid my finger under the flap and tore it open. The paper inside was thick, high-quality stock. There was no greeting card, no friendly note. The top sheet was a single page of typed text, just like the label on the outside. But there was also a sheaf of other documents behind it, thick and official-looking, held together with a large metal clip. I pulled out the single typed page. My eyes scanned the first few lines, and the air left my lungs in a sudden, silent gasp. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The letters on the page swam before my eyes, sharp and cruel and utterly unbelievable. It began without preamble, without salutation. It just said, Mrs. Sarah Peterson, if you are reading this, it is because you need to know the truth about the Thanksgiving dinner you were expecting. Your son and daughter-in-law did not have a family emergency. They were at a celebration dinner with her father, Robert Miller, and a man named Arthur Vance. They were celebrating the imminent, fraudulent sale of your home at 12 Elm Street. The words on the page didn't compute at first. They were just a string of black characters on white paper, nonsensical and absurd. Fraudulent sale of your home. It was like reading a line from a bad movie, something so melodramatic and disconnected from my reality that my brain simply refused to process it. I read the sentence again, and a third time. A low, humming sound started in my ears, blocking out the quiet ticking of the kitchen clock. My house, 12 Elm Street. The house David and I had bought 40 years ago with a down payment we'd barely scraped together. The house where I'd brought Michael home from the hospital, where his height chart was still faintly visible on the pantry doorframe. The house that was not just a collection of wood and bricks, but the very vessel of my life, the container of all my memories. To be sold? Without my knowledge? It was impossible. A sick, cruel joke. My trembling fingers reached for the thick stack of documents clipped behind the letter. I slid the clip off. The pages fanned out across the table. They were copies. Copies of legal forms, bank statements, official-looking papers filled with dense, impenetrable jargon. But certain words leaped out at me, stark and terrifying. Power of attorney, sale agreement, title transfer. And there, at the bottom of several pages, was a signature. My signature. Sarah Peterson. Or at least a very, very convincing forgery of it. It had my familiar loops, the way my S leaned slightly to the left, the sharp downstroke of the P. Seeing it there, on documents I had never seen before, made my blood run cold. It was a violation so profound, so intimate, it felt like someone had stolen my own skin. I forced myself to go back to the typed letter, my eyes scanning the text with a new, horrified focus. The anonymous author laid out the entire scheme with a chilling, dispassionate clarity. It was all Jessica. Jessica and her father, Robert Miller. My image of him, a stuffy, but ultimately harmless man who smelled of expensive cologne and played golf, shattered and reformed into something monstrous. The letter explained that Robert's real estate development business was in serious trouble. He was leveraged to the hilt, facing ruin. He needed a quick, quiet infusion of cash, and he had set his sights on my house. It was in a desirable neighborhood, fully paid off, an easy target. The power of attorney document was the key. According to the letter, Jessica had brought it to me months ago, hidden within a stack of other routine financial papers for Michael's new business venture. She had told me it was just a formality, something the bank needed to show family support. "Just sign here, Sarah." I could almost hear her musical voice saying, her perfectly manicured finger pointing to the line. "It's just boring bank stuff." I remembered that day. She'd come over with a box of pastries from an expensive bakery. We'd had coffee. She'd been so charming, so full of praise for how well Michael was doing, how this new business was going to be their big break. I had been so proud, so eager to help. I'd signed without reading, trusting them completely, trusting my son. The memory made me physically ill. I bent over the table, bile rising in my throat. And Michael? What was his role in this nightmare? The letter addressed that too. Michael, it seemed, was not the villain, but the fool. Jessica had sold him a story about needing to leverage the house's equity as collateral for a business loan. She had convinced him it was a temporary measure, that they would pay it all back with interest within a year. He never knew they were planning an outright sale. He was, the letter stated, a willing pawn, blinded by his wife's ambition and his own desire to please her. He had facilitated the deception, hounded me with phone calls about the business papers, and reassured me it was all above board. The thought of his betrayal was, in some ways, even more painful than Jessica's malice. She was a relative stranger, an outsider. But Michael? He was my flesh and blood. He had helped them put the collar around my neck. The final piece of the puzzle was the buyer, Arthur Vance. He wasn't a real buyer. He was a business associate of Robert Miller's, a shell corporation specialist who would buy the house for a fraction of its market value, allowing Miller to get the cash he needed, while Vance would then flip the property for a massive profit, which they would split. The Thanksgiving dinner I had been uninvited from wasn't a family emergency. It was a closing party. They were toasting their success, celebrating their victory, while I sat alone in the house they had just stolen from me. The letter was signed simply, "A discarded employee." The author explained in a final paragraph that he had worked for Robert Miller for 15 years. He had helped him with shady deals before, but this, defrauding a widowed mother out of her family home, was a bridge too far. When he'd voiced his objections, Miller had fired him, threatening to ruin his reputation if he ever spoke a word. This letter was his revenge. It was his way of clearing his conscience and of bringing Robert Miller's house of cards tumbling down. He had included his own contact information, a burner phone number and an anonymous email address, at the very bottom. In case you decide to fight back. I leaned back in my chair, the papers spread before me like the wreckage of a plane crash. The humming in my ears had been replaced by a deafening silence. The grief and sadness I had felt earlier were gone, burned away by a white-hot rage that was so pure and so intense it was almost clarifying. It was a cold, hard, diamond-like anger. They had underestimated me. They saw me as a sweet, clueless old woman, a relic to be managed and ultimately disposed of. They thought I would just fade away, confused and helpless. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They had forgotten that I was David Peterson's wife, and David had never backed down from a fight in his life. I looked down at my hands. They were no longer trembling. They were perfectly still. I gathered the papers, tapping them into a neat, orderly pile. The forged signature, the fake sale agreement, the anonymous letter. It was my ammunition. The war had just begun. I felt a strange, terrifying calm settle over me. The tears were over. The time for sorrow was over. Now it was time for justice. I stood up, walked over to the sink, and carefully began to wash the silver. I had a lot to do tomorrow, and I wanted to start the day with a clean slate. The next morning, I woke up before dawn. I hadn't really slept, but had drifted in and out of a strange, vigilant state. The stack of incriminating documents lying on my nightstand like a loaded gun. The rage from the night before had not dissipated. It had cooled and hardened into a focused, deliberate resolve. I was no longer Sarah Peterson, the lonely widow. I was an army of one. I showered and dressed, not in a soft sweater, but in a pair of crisp trousers and a structured blazer David had always said made me look like a CEO. I needed to feel powerful today. My first call was not to a lawyer. It was to Michael. I knew I had to face him first. I needed to look him in the eye and see for myself what was left of the son I had raised. I dialed his number. He answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep and, I suspected, a manufactured cheerfulness. "Mom, hey, I was just about to call you. How are you?" My voice, when it came out, was a stranger to me. It was low, flat, and devoid of any emotion. "Michael, I need you to come over, now." There was a pause. I could hear the rustle of sheets. Is everything okay? You sound weird." "I am fine," I said, the words as cold and sharp as ice chips. "But we need to talk. Come alone. Do not bring Jessica. Do you understand me?" The command in my voice was so unusual, so unlike the gentle, accommodating mother he knew, that it shocked him into silence for a moment. Yeah, okay, Mom. I'll be there in half an hour." He sounded rattled, confused. Good. While I waited, I didn't pace. I sat at the dining room table, the one that had been the scene of my humiliation just hours before, and I laid out the documents in a neat, damning row. The power of attorney, the sale agreement, the typed letter. I placed them with the precision of a prosecutor arranging evidence. When the doorbell rang exactly 28 minutes later, my heart was a steady, rhythmic drum. I was ready. I opened the door to find Michael standing on the porch, looking anxious. He was holding a small bouquet of grocery store carnations, a pathetic, transparent peace offering. "Hey, Mom," he began, forcing a smile. "I am so sorry about yesterday. It was just crazy. Jess's dad, he had this health scare, and we had to rush over there, and—" I didn't let him finish. I just held the door open and stared at him with my cold, new eyes. "Get in, Michael." He faltered, the rest of his lie dying on his lips. He walked into the house, his gaze flicking around the immaculate, sterile-looking rooms. "You cleaned up already," he murmured, as if that were the strangest thing in the world. "I had plenty of time," I said. I led him to the dining room. "Sit down." He saw the papers on the table, and his face went pale. He sank into a chair, his eyes wide, darting from the documents to my face. He looked like a cornered animal. What is all this?" he stammered, though I could see in his eyes that he knew. He knew exactly what it was. I didn't speak. I just pointed to the power of attorney form with the forged signature, then to the sale agreement, then to the anonymous letter. I let him read. I watched as the blood drained from his face, as a slick sheen of sweat broke out on his forehead. I watched as the flimsy facade of his lies crumbled, exposing the weak, terrified man underneath. He finished the letter and looked up at me, his eyes swimming with a mixture of terror and a shame so profound it was almost pitiful. "Mom, he began, his voice a choked whisper. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know they were selling it. She told me it was just for a loan, just collateral. She said we'd pay it all back in a few months. She swore to me." "And you believed her?" I asked, my voice still unnervingly calm. "You helped her trick your own mother into signing away her home, the home your father and I built, and you just believed her?" The dam broke. He buried his face in his hands, and his shoulders began to shake with deep, wrenching sobs. "I'm so stupid," he wept, the words muffled by his hands. "I'm so stupid. I just wanted to make her happy. She has these dreams, this big life she wants, and I felt like I was never enough. This business was supposed to be my chance to finally give her that. I didn't read the papers. I just signed where she told me to sign. I trusted her." I looked at my son, a grown man, weeping like a child at my dining room table, and I felt nothing. The space where my maternal sympathy should have been was a cold, empty void. All I could see was his weakness, his complicity. "You didn't just trust her, Michael," I said, my voice like steel. "You lied to me. You looked me in the face and you lied. You let me plan a dinner, let me get my hopes up, while you were planning to go out and celebrate stealing from me. You didn't just break my trust, you broke my heart. And then you sent me a text message." The mention of the text seemed to wound him more than anything else. He flinched. "I know. Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." As he was babbling his apologies, his phone, sitting on the table beside him, lit up and began to buzz. The caller ID was bright and clear. Jessica. A new icy idea took root in my mind. Before Michael could react, I leaned forward and tapped the green answer icon, then immediately hit the speakerphone button. "Michael, baby, where are you?" Jessica's voice, sweet as poison, filled the silent room. "My father is asking about those final transfer codes. Did you get them from your mother's old bank files yet?" Michael froze, his face a mask of pure horror. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. I leaned toward the phone. "He's a little busy right now, Jessica," I said, my voice calm and clear. There was a sharp, shocked intake of breath on the other end of the line. The silence stretched for a few seconds. When Jessica spoke again, the sugary sweetness was gone, replaced by a tone that was pure, venomous ice. "You," she hissed. "What have you done?" "I've just been doing a little light reading," I replied, my eyes locked on my son's terrified face. "Power of attorney, sale agreements. It's all very educational. You should have come for my casserole yesterday, Jessica. We had so much to talk about." Another beat of silence. Then a click. She had hung up. The spell was broken. Michael looked from the phone to me, his eyes wide with a dawning, catastrophic understanding of what he had done and what was about to happen. The battle lines had been drawn, and he was standing directly in the crossfire. The confrontation with Jessica over the phone was the catalyst. It was like kicking an anthill. The immediate aftermath was a flurry of panicked, chaotic activity. Within an hour, I had contacted the anonymous whistleblower, Frank, using the burner number he'd provided. He answered on the first ring. His voice was gravelly, world-weary. I told him who I was, and he simply said, "I've been waiting for your call. What do you need?" I hired the lawyer he recommended, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Elena Ramirez, who specialized in real estate fraud. When I met Elena the next day, I brought my neat pile of documents and Michael. He sat beside me in her sleek, downtown office, looking pale and diminished, a ghost of the confident young man he used to be. Elena listened to my story without interruption, her expression unreadable. She examined the documents, her sharp eyes missing nothing. When I was finished, she looked from me to Michael. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her tone professional but firm. "Your mother's story is compelling, and this evidence is strong. But it will be infinitely stronger with your full, sworn cooperation. You need to understand what that means. It means testifying against your wife and your father-in-law. It means telling the entire, ugly truth in a deposition, and possibly in court. You will be a key witness for the prosecution. There is no middle ground here. You are either with your mother, or you are with them." I watched my son. This was his moment of truth, the crossroads he had been stumbling towards his entire life. He had to choose. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading sorrow. I offered him nothing. No comforting smile, no nod of encouragement. This had to be his decision, and his alone. He took a deep breath, his shoulders squaring almost imperceptibly. "I'll do it," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." And so it began. Elena filed a lawsuit to halt the sale of the house and a formal complaint with the district attorney's office. The wheels of justice turn slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. The first move was an emergency injunction to block the title transfer, which was granted almost immediately thanks to Frank's documents. The buyer, Arthur Vance, disappeared the moment legal papers were served. Frank later told us he had likely fled the country. The fallout in the Miller family was immediate and spectacular. Robert Miller, the self-styled titan of local real estate, was suddenly facing fraud charges. His carefully constructed empire of respectability began to crumble. Business partners distanced themselves. Bank loans were called in. The story was picked up by the local news, a small article at first, buried in the business section. Local developer accused of fraud in family dispute. But it was enough. The Millers' perfect, polished world was cracking at the seams. The war between Michael and Jessica was brutal. She called him a dozen times a day, alternating between tearful pleas and venomous threats. Her lawyers sent letters accusing him of being the mastermind behind the whole scheme, of trying to frame her. But we had the anonymous letter, and we had Frank. Frank, it turned out, was a treasure trove of dirt. He had been Robert Miller's disgruntled bookkeeper for 15 years. He had copies of ledgers, emails, and recorded conversations that painted a damning picture not just of the attempt to steal my house, but of a long pattern of tax evasion, kickbacks, and shady dealings. He had been Miller's loyal soldier until they had targeted me, an act he saw as unforgivably cruel. He met with Elena and my legal team, a quiet, unassuming man in a worn-out suit, and systematically handed them the ammunition to destroy Robert Miller's career. He was our unlikely and invaluable ally. Through it all, Michael lived in a strange limbo. He moved out of the pristine condo he shared with Jessica and into a sad, little furnished apartment across town. He lost his job at the tech startup, a position Robert Miller had secured for him, and ended up taking a job at a local hardware store. It was humbling, difficult work. He was quiet, withdrawn. He called me every day, not to ask for forgiveness, but just to check in. "Hi, Mom. It's me. Just wanted to see how you were." The conversations were stilted, awkward. The chasm between us was vast. His betrayal had shattered something fundamental, and I didn't know if it could ever be repaired. I was grateful for his cooperation, for his choice to stand on the side of truth. But gratitude is a far cry from love and trust. I saw him not as my child, but as a co-belligerent in a war I never wanted to fight. One evening, about 2 months into the legal battle, he came over. He looked tired, older than his 31 years. He stood awkwardly in my kitchen, a place where he had once been so comfortable. "I just wanted to say," he started, his voice rough, "I know sorry isn't enough. I know I don't deserve for you to ever forgive me. But I want you to know. I see it now. I see how I let her values become my values. I spent so much time trying to be the man I thought she wanted. I forgot to be the man you and Dad raised me to be. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be that man again." I just nodded. It was a good speech. I believed he meant it. But the words couldn't erase the image of the forged signature. They couldn't fill the silence of that Thanksgiving day. They couldn't magically heal the wound he had carved into my heart. Rebuilding our relationship wouldn't be a matter of a single apology. It would be a long, arduous process, like rebuilding a house from the foundation up after it had burned to the ground. And a part of me wasn't sure I still had the energy for that kind of construction. I had spent the last few months tearing something down. I didn't know if I had it in me to build anything new. The legal proceedings dragged on for nearly a year. It was a grueling, emotionally draining process of depositions, hearings, and endless paperwork. Jessica and her father fought viciously, their high-priced lawyers employing every delay tactic and dirty trick in the book. They tried to paint me as a senile old woman who had agreed to the sale and then forgotten. They tried to portray Michael as a spurned, vengeful husband. But the evidence was overwhelming. Frank's meticulous records, combined with Michael's unwavering testimony, created an ironclad case. In the end, there was no dramatic courtroom trial. Faced with the mountain of evidence against them and the prospect of criminal charges, the Millers folded. They agreed to a settlement. The fraudulent sale was officially voided, and the title to my house was unequivocally restored to me. They were forced to pay all of my legal fees. plus a substantial sum in damages for emotional distress and punitive action. Robert Miller's real estate license was revoked, and he and Jessica both pleaded guilty to lesser criminal charges to avoid prison time, receiving hefty fines and a long period of probation. Their reign of quiet, suburban tyranny was over. Their name, once a symbol of wealth and class, was now synonymous with scandal. Michael and Jessica's divorce was finalized during that time. It was a quiet affair, a footnote in the larger, more dramatic story. He gave her everything she wanted from their shared assets, eager to sever the final tie. He continued to work at the hardware store, living in his small apartment. He was paying a price for his weakness, and he seemed determined to pay it without complaint. Life slowly returned to a new kind of normal for me. The house at 12 Elm Street was mine again, not just legally, but emotionally. For a long time after the letter arrived, it had felt like a crime scene. Every room held a ghost of the betrayal. But slowly, I reclaimed it. I rearranged the furniture. I painted the dining room a warm, sunny yellow. I filled the house not with silence, but with music. Old jazz records David had loved. I found a quiet strength in my solitude, a resilience I never knew I possessed. I was not the same woman I was before that Thanksgiving. The naive, trusting part of me was gone forever, and I didn't miss her. In her place was someone tougher, warier, but also more self-reliant. A year passed. The leaves began to turn again, painting the neighborhood in shades of amber and crimson. Thanksgiving was approaching. The thought of it sent a cold shiver through me, a phantom limb of last year's pain. I had no intention of cooking a feast. The very idea of a turkey in my oven made me feel ill. I planned to spend the day reading a book and perhaps taking a long walk in the crisp autumn air. 2 days before the holiday, Michael called. "Mom?" he said, his voice hesitant. "I know you're probably not doing anything for Thanksgiving, and I don't want to impose. But I was wondering, could I just come over for a little while? I don't need dinner. I could bring a coffee. I don't want you to be alone. And I don't want to be alone either." I was quiet for a long moment, looking out my kitchen window at the bare branches of the old oak tree in the backyard. The wound was still there. It had scarred over, but it was still tender to the touch. Forgiveness was a complicated, messy thing. But as I looked at that tree which had survived countless storms, I knew that some things, however damaged, were worth saving. Some roots run too deep to be pulled up so easily. "You don't have to bring coffee," I said, my voice softer than it had been with him in a year. "I was thinking of making soup. Maybe you could come over and help me chop the vegetables." It wasn't a feast. It wasn't a celebration. It was just a small, quiet offering. A beginning. I knew our relationship would never be what it was. The blind trust and innocent love of the past were gone, casualties of a war we had both survived. But maybe, just maybe, we could build something new on the ruins. Something quieter, more honest, and in its own way, stronger. I hung up the phone, and for the first time in a very long time, the silence in the house didn't feel heavy or oppressive. It just felt peaceful, like the calm after a very long storm. The doorbell rang at precisely 11 o'clock on Thanksgiving morning. It was a crisp, clear day, the kind where the sky is a pale, flawless blue, and the air has a bite to it that feels clean and sharp. I had spent the morning not in a flurry of cooking, but in quiet contemplation, a mug of tea warming my hands as I sat in the living room. The house was clean, the silence was gentle. When the bell chimed, my heart didn't leap with anxious hope. It gave a slow, steady beat, a single, measured rhythm. I was calm. I walked to the door and opened it. Michael stood on the porch, his hands shoved into the pockets of his worn denim jacket. He wasn't holding flowers or any other kind of token. He was just there, his shoulders slightly hunched against the cold, his expression uncertain. He looked older than he had a year ago. The easy confidence of his youth had been stripped away, replaced by something more sober, more cautious. There were new lines around his eyes. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice quiet. "Michael," I replied, my tone even. "You're right on time. Come in." I stepped back and he entered the house, his eyes scanning the entryway as if seeing it for the first time. He was a guest now, not a resident. The dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, a history of pain and betrayal that we were both consciously trying not to acknowledge. It was a fragile truce. "It smells good in here," he said, following me into the kitchen. "Different, but good." "It's just soup," I said, gesturing to the large pot simmering on the stove. "Onions and garlic. I waited for you for the rest of the vegetables." On the wooden butcher block, I had laid out a small mountain of carrots, celery, and potatoes, all scrubbed and ready. 2 cutting boards and 2 knives sat beside them. An invitation. He seemed to understand. He took off his jacket, hung it carefully on the back of a chair, and walked over to the sink to wash his hands. I watched him, noticing the way his hands were chapped and reddened, the knuckles nicked with small cuts. The hands of a man who worked at a hardware store, who lifted heavy boxes and dealt with splintered wood. They were not the soft, smooth hands of the man who had sat at Jessica's side. We stood side by side at the counter, chopping vegetables in a shared, rhythmic silence. Chop, chop, chop. The sound filled the kitchen, a steady, industrious percussion. It was a language we didn't need to translate. We were doing something together, something simple and constructive. I remembered all the times we had stood like this when he was a boy, him helping me make cookies, his small hands covered in flour. The memory was a dull ache, a phantom limb. I pushed it away. "The carrots need to be smaller," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "They take longer to cook?" "Right," he said, not looking at me, and adjusted his technique. He was listening. He was trying. For an hour, we worked. We chopped. We stirred the pot. We added herbs. The conversation was sparse, limited to the task at hand. "Do you need more salt?" "Pass me the bay leaves." It was safe territory. We didn't talk about Jessica. We didn't talk about her father. We didn't talk about the lawsuit or the settlement or the past year of his life. We were 2 people making soup. That was all we could handle right now. When the soup was finally simmering, its rich, savory aroma filling the house with a genuine warmth, I ladled it into 2 bowls. I set them on the small kitchen table, the one we had always used for breakfast. It felt less formal, less freighted with the ghosts of Thanksgivings past, than the dining room. I cut thick slices from a loaf of crusty bread. We sat down opposite each other. Michael bowed his head for a moment before picking up his spoon, a gesture I hadn't seen him make in years. We ate in silence for a few minutes. The soup was good. It was nourishing and real. "This is nice, Mom," he said finally, looking up at me. His eyes were clear. "Thank you for letting me come." "I'm glad you're here, Michael," I said. And I was surprised to find that I meant it. The anger had cooled to embers. The sharp edges of the pain had been worn smooth by time. What was left was a deep, complicated sadness. and a flicker of something else. Something that might one day grow into a new kind of love. It was in that quiet moment, that first fragile step across the chasm between us, that we heard the sound. The distinct metallic clink of the mail slot in the front door, followed by the soft thud of letters hitting the hardwood floor of the entryway. It was a normal, everyday sound. But for a reason I couldn't explain, a cold dread snaked its way up my spine. The mail was late today. Very late for a holiday. I excused myself from the table and walked into the hall. There were 3 envelopes on the floor. 2 were junk mail, addressed to current resident. The third was a pale ivory color, made of thick, expensive paper. My name, Sarah Peterson, was written across the front in an elegant, looping script that I recognized instantly. It was Jessica's handwriting. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen, staring down at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake coiled on my floor. "Mom, is everything okay?" Michael called from the kitchen. I couldn't answer. I bent down, my fingers trembling slightly, and picked it up. It was heavy, and it was faintly perfumed with the same floral scent she always wore. I turned it over. There was no return address. Of course not. She wouldn't be so transparent. I walked back into the kitchen, holding the letter like a piece of unexploded ordnance. Michael took one look at my face, then at the envelope in my hand. The color drained from his cheeks. He put his spoon down with a clatter. "What is that?" he asked, though his eyes, wide with a familiar, haunted look, told me he already knew. "It's from Jessica," I said, my voice flat. He flinched as if I had struck him. He stared at the letter, his jaw tight. For a moment, I saw the old, cornered look in his eyes, the look of a man trapped between 2 opposing forces. I braced myself for a prevarication, an excuse, a plea to just ignore it. But then something in his expression hardened. The fear was replaced by a cold, weary anger. "Throw it out," he said, his voice low and firm. "Don't read it. Whatever it is, it's a lie. Just throw it away and we can finish our soup." I looked at him, then down at the letter. He was right. That was the sensible thing to do. To not let her poison into my house, into this fragile peace we were trying to build. But the woman I was now, the woman forged in the fire of the last year, didn't run from things. She faced them. "No," I said, my gaze meeting his. "I'm not going to throw it away. We're not going to pretend she doesn't exist. She's a part of this story, a part of what happened to us. We don't hide from things anymore, Michael. We look them in the eye." I sat back down at the table, and with a steady hand, I tore open the envelope. Michael watched me, his face a grim mask. I pulled out a single sheet of matching ivory paper, folded in half. I unfolded it and began to read aloud, my voice clear and steady in the quiet kitchen. "Dearest Sarah," it began, the salutation itself a masterpiece of false intimacy. "I know it must be a surprise to hear from me. I have spent the last year in a state of profound regret and sorrow. I know that you believe I wronged you, and for the part my youthful ambition played in the misunderstanding over the house. I am truly sorry. I was naive, and I was manipulated by my father, who, as you now know, is not the man he appears to be. He is a broken man now, Sarah, his life in ruins, and I am all alone, trying to pick up the pieces of a life that was shattered by this terrible ordeal." I paused and looked at Michael. He was staring into his soup bowl, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. I continued reading. "I have lost everything. My husband, my home, my reputation. I have learned a very hard lesson about trust, I write to you now not to ask for forgiveness, as I know that is too much to hope for, but to appeal to the kindness and compassion that I know is in your heart. I am required to meet with my parole officer soon for a review. A character statement from you, speaking to my remorse and the difficult lessons I have learned, would mean the world. It would show them that I am not the monster the world thinks I am. It might give me a chance to start over, to build a new, honest life. Please, Sarah, think of the son you raised. He once loved me. Surely there was some good in me for him to see. I finished reading and placed the letter on the table between us. The air crackled with tension. The manipulative genius of it was breathtaking. It was a tapestry woven of half-truths, self-pity, and blame-shifting, all designed to paint herself as the ultimate victim and to corner me into a position where refusing her would make me the cruel, unforgiving one. And the final, vicious twist of the knife. Using my son's past love for her as a weapon against me. I didn't look at Michael. I just waited. This was his test. The ultimate test. Would some lingering loyalty, some ghost of his former life, rise up? Would he see a damsel in distress? He was silent for a long, heavy minute. Then he pushed his chair back, stood up and took the letter from the table. He held it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were contaminated. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the man his father had been. Strong, resolute, unflinching. She's asking you to lie for her, he said, his voice cold as stone. After everything she did, she's asking your permission to build her new, honest life on top of one more lie. A lie you would have to tell. He walked over to the fireplace in the adjoining living room. He crumpled the letter into a tight ball. He took a long match from the box on the mantelpiece, struck it, and held the flame to the paper. It caught, curling into a black-edged orange flame. He dropped it into the cold hearth, and we both stood there, side by side, watching it burn until it was nothing but a fragile, gray ash. He turned to me. "There was good in you, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. That's what I saw. When I looked at her, I was just seeing a reflection of the life you and Dad gave me. And I thought she wanted that too. I was wrong. I was a fool. But I'm not a fool anymore. He had passed the test. He had seen the truth, clear and unvarnished. He had chosen a side, not just with his testimony, but with his heart. He had chosen me. The chasm between us didn't vanish in that moment. But a bridge had been built, strong and sure, right across it. I nodded, a lump forming in my own throat. I walked back to the kitchen table. "Our soup is getting cold," I said softly. He followed me and sat down. He picked up his spoon. We finished our meal in a new kind of silence. It wasn't the awkward, painful silence of before. It was a comfortable, peaceful quiet. The quiet of two survivors who had weathered a terrible storm and finally found their way back to a safe harbor. It wasn't the happy ending I had dreamed of all those years ago. It was something far more precious. It was real.